few of the key points. The key reasons why I will be voting against this motion, and a few of the key reasons why I am very, very hopeful a majority of council will vote against this motion. And I will speak fairly quickly because I know that we do have the 5-minute rule. For the benefit of the viewers, a little bit of history is in order. Prior to this council voting in favor of RAV, TransLink's version of RAV, the Richmond Airport Vancouver line, Councillor Cadman moved a very good motion, and that motion carried 10-1. That motion put this council on record as being opposed to a PPP, a private-public partnership. Regrettably, TransLink has decided in its wisdom not to give any effect to that motion and instead to focus only on council's later motion in support of RAV. Now, in an ideal world, although I'm opposed to PPPs, I will concede there are some situations where there's at least an argument to be made in favor of the PPP. Those situations are where risk has been transferred to the private investor. There are on the RAV line, your worship, a number of risks, but the two most significant risks, the risks that are right up at the very top, are the ridership projections and the ton-1 cost. And when asked, TransLink tells us that not a single dollar of either of those risks are being transferred to the private investor. That caused me great concern from day one. And that's why I voted with Councillor Cadman against a PPP. I would have voted against RAV when it first came to council if I'd known that Councillor Cadman's motion would in reality have absolutely no effect. Through no lack of effort on Councillor Cadman's part, but simply because TransLink has chosen not to pay attention to that motion. Well, your worship, last weekend, on Saturday, the Vancouver Sun disclosed the contents of a confidential federal report which raised these very concerns, that there simply is far too much risk left on the shoulders of the public investor, you, I, and our taxpayers, and far too little risk on these two very risky items, ridership and tunneling, left on the shoulders of the private investor. So there's the PPP aspect. If we're opposed to PPP, and now that we know, which we didn't know when we voted for RAV the first time, that TransLink will be proceeding with an RFP that contemplates a PPP, a request for proposals that calls for a PPP. If we're opposed to PPP, we must vote against this motion. I will conclude, your worship, not on the PPP point, but on the economics. $1.8 billion, best case scenario, probably more than that, but let's say it does only cost $1.8 billion. For that amount of money, we could get not TransLink's RAV, but at-grade LRT on the Arbutus corridor, a rapid bus on Cambie that would deliver approximately 75% of the ridership that TransLink projects RAV will deliver, and there would still be enough money left over to deliver at-grade LRT in the northeast sector of the GVRD, which is the #1 priority of the GVRD, the #1 priority of our regional district.
15 seconds.
And so on that point, I conclude, your worship, and I urge my fellow councillors, if they're opposed to PPP, if they're in favor of the sound use of our taxpayers' dollars, to vote against this motion, especially in light of the federal report. Thank you, your worship.
Councillor Sullivan?
I can't believe Councillor Lewis wants to argue the merits of the RAV line. If he understands the principles of democracy, you look at the issues, you consider them, you vote. And the outcome of that vote determines where you're going as a corporation, as a city. GVRD voted in favor. TransLink voted in favor. The city voted in favor. The province voted in favor. We're all unanimously decided where we're going. This is what you call democracy. Now, Councillor Lewis mentioned that this is the largest amount of money that we are dealing with in our term. It's true. It's $1.7 billion. It's a lot of money. It's not just $1.7 billion that we're going to spend, it's $1.7 billion that we're going to receive. This is the federal government, about $500 million coming from other parts of this country into Vancouver. And I must say, remind him that this money is coming in to basically hire union workers, good wages, to build an important piece of infrastructure, a transit infrastructure. Finally, after so many years, we're finally investing in transit. Now, you know what will happen if we don't go with this. This money will go to the Kicking Horse Pass to build what? A road. And I'm sure it will be good union jobs there, but it will be Kicking Horse Pass's union jobs versus Vancouver's. Now, I don't understand where Councillor Lewis is coming from. First of all, I do recall Councillor Roberts and Councillor Bass at the very lengthy meeting we had till 1 in the morning to finally decide this issue. And I remember them saying distinctly, we insist that all the governments and agencies would listen to our conditions and would listen to us when we put conditions on this initiative. And then what I was surprised to see is when the city voted and did our democratic process to vote for the RAB line and the conditions, our own councillors went and, representing other levels of government, did not respect the city's duly voted conditions. This is hypocrisy. Now, I also recall the issue of the Olympics, very similar, where 1/2 of all the COPE councillors voted against the Olympics, and several others were dragged kicking and screaming by the mayor into support for it. Here we are, Kyoto, we're supporting Kyoto, we're supporting union jobs, and I will make mention of the federal report. The federal report is very interesting. It says this is a terrible deal, therefore we're only going to put $350 million into it. That doesn't make sense. If it's such a terrible deal, don't put any money in it. So I believe that there's a lot of question marks that I have around that federal report. $450 million is 1/3 of the total project here. Now, we have a long-standing tradition. In infrastructure, the local governments come up with 2/3, the federal government comes up with 1/3. If you add the three elements together, TransLink, airport, and provincial government, that's $900 million. That equals 2/3. We are asking the federal government to come forward with their 1/3 as is their duty to do in this confederal system. And I think we all have to get behind this. If we don't support the RAB line, we must support democracy, the democratic process, and if you don't want to support the democratic process, at least you can support your mayor. I think our mayor's done a great job in driving this project forward, representing the city of Vancouver, and I think we should all get behind him on this one and do a non-partisan, small letters, vote to support the mayor. Thank you.
Just a point of clarification. No councillors on either side were dragged kicking or screaming into anything. Councillor Roberts.
Okay. I want to start is that I appreciate what Councillor Lewis has said about some of the history of the RAD project, and I won't repeat those arguments. But to say that from the beginning, I've had huge concerns about a P3 project and about putting a RAB project in a tunnel because it would double the costs of the project. And so that when the vote went through here, and as Councillor Sullivan explained, there was a vote here, and then right the next day we went to the GVRD to vote. Some things happened between the times of the vote here and the time of the GVRD. One of the things that happened was that the GVTA decided to go ahead with the P3, and then that decision was affirmed at the GVRD. It was not allowed to be challenged, which the Cope councillors tried to do to question the P3, and therefore it was only logical that those who had voted in support of RAB on condition that it not be a P3, it was only logical that then that vote would be carried through. So to not belabor the history, which I don't think we need to do here, what I think the important thing to do is look ahead. And we now have a situation where, although there's been requests from the federal government for $450 million, that's not been committed. So we're not there yet. There's some indication of 300 million, maybe 350 million, and obviously we want that. We want that for transit. We want to improve rapid transit in this region. We are in desperate need of improving transit. And we want that money to go in ways that will improve transit between Richmond and Vancouver and will not cannibalize the bus system and will not take away from the other transit improvements that are needed in this region. So I'm very much in support of calling on the federal government to commit that 300 million or 450 million, if it will, to improve rapid transit between Richmond and Vancouver. Now, will it be the RAV line as proposed, as committed by the GVTA and the GVRD? I don't think it can be. I don't think the money is there. I think the reality is that there are many risks associated with that project. It has put the federal government, it has made them feel cautious about committing money to this project. And I think what we have to do, and what this is an opportunity to do, is to take a second look and to go back to the drawing boards and make sure that we do it right. And one of the things we can do is simply ask the TransLink to begin a study and say, all right, we don't have the full amount that was requested. We're not there. We haven't put that together. We have $1.2 billion, though. That's a great start for transit. We have commitments from the airport and the GVRD and the province, 300 million each. If we get 300 million from the federal government, that gives us $1.2 billion to do a transit project that would work for this region. Therefore, let's look at it. There's creative opportunities. We could look at different options. We could look at what could we do to serve the bus riders and transit users in this region with that $1.2 billion. And that's what I'd like to see go forward. I want to see a motion where we are calling on the federal government, supporting the work of the mayor and trying to get more money into transit in this region. But we should do that project right. And there have been risks associated with it as it's been defined. Then let's step back. We've got time. We don't need to be pushed forward into something that is going to turn into some sort of big dig on the West Coast. Therefore, we can re-examine this and do it right. And so I'm not going to support this motion as it stands because I want the federal government to contribute to rapid transit that would serve everyone and that would serve the best possible options for improving rapid transit between Richmond and Vancouver. That's not the RAV line it's defined, but it could be an even better one if we work toward that.
Councillor Ladner, sir.
I'd just like to add a few points and respond to a couple of points. I think our objections to the P3 are well known and are on the record and perhaps even be taken into consideration by the people running this project. But I think we have to remember that this is not our money we're talking about. And just before I stop with the P3, if we don't want the P3, surely there's all the more reason to want more public money in here, so we don't have to rely so much on a private operator or a private investor. So I think if you're not in favor of the P3, you should be more in favor of the federal government putting more money in. But ultimately, this is someone else's money, and it's, I would love to be able to design an ideal system for Vancouver that we could spend somebody else's money on, but I don't think it's at all realistic to expect that if we don't go ahead with this project, that money's waiting around, or all the money except for the added $150 million is waiting around for something else that we'd like to spend it on. This is not our money. We don't have the say. All we have to say is to whether we welcome the money or we don't. And that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. And I think this council, we tried on during our long debate an idea that we would entertain requests for proposals and everybody could come in and say what they want to do. We wouldn't put any limits or any guidelines on it. And then at the end of it all, we could say, well, we like it or we don't like it. People don't invest hundreds of millions of dollars under those conditions. And we've had our say and we've made our points. And now I think we have to make the point that this project overall, for all its faults, is a net benefit. And it's the only one that we have anywhere near this amount of money being offered for. We should take the money, or we should ask for the money at least. Thank you.
Yes, to deal with the issue of the P3, as I understand, the GVRD is open to the P3, but it may not happen. Just to the case where the convention center, a P3 was attempted, but the private partner abandoned it, and that is now reverted to a public process. So I think this could happen as well here. And I think it's really important to realize, if you vote against this, what you are voting for is money to the Kicking Horse Pass to fund roads in some other community. We have an opportunity to bring federal money to British Columbia, $450 million, to come to Vancouver, and I remind you, union jobs, good jobs in Vancouver, paid for by citizens throughout Canada. Now, there is much talk about the West not getting its fair shake in Confederation. I don't like to get involved in that debate, but this is an opportunity for us to get federal money, a significant amount, $500 million almost, into Vancouver. And it is difficult for us to impose our will on this project because we're not paying for it. The city of Vancouver is not paying for the $1.7 billion. TransLink, all the members of the region, will be contributing to our city, and we are the city, as Councillor Ladner reminds us in his motion, that it is the city of Vancouver that will be the biggest beneficiary of this line. We are going to the federal government, and it's a difficult fight. There are many, many members of parliament that do not want this much money coming to the West, and especially coming to Vancouver. I can tell you, if we all vote for this, it's not guaranteed we're going to get this, but I can pretty well guarantee you, if you don't vote for this, I don't see any chance of getting us this money. I insist, I implore you, please support Councillor Ladner's resolution. Remember, all his resolution says is that we strongly endorse the efforts of our mayor, the premier, and TransLink officials to persuade the government to immediately commit $450 million as its contribution to the RAV line. We're asking, this is not a difficult motion, and so I do very, very deeply implore you to support this vote. Support your mayor. Thank you.
Well, I find myself in an interesting position here because I'm going to vote for both motions. Because I believe that in the first motion, we're asking for the $450 million for RAV. If we don't get it in the second motion, I'm voting for it because we're going to get $450 million that's going to TransLink. So, quite frankly, I don't see myself losing on either one of these. I want the $450 million, and I don't care what it goes towards, as long as it's going towards transit. And so, I'm gonna vote for both of them. Councillor Cadman.
Well, I find it quite interesting, Councillor Ladner and Councillor Sullivan refer to getting money from the rest of Canada. In fact, we send $400 million in our gas tax every single year to Ottawa. So what we're trying to do is get a little bit of that back. So this is not money from the rest of Canada, as you describe it. It is in fact our revenue. What I find interesting is when Gordon Campbell made the request to Jean Chrétien on June the 27th, 2002, he requested not $450 million, but $300 million, just a year ago. And so somebody here is playing games with the federal government when they have in fact agreed to commit what was initially requested, and now we seem to be having an upping of the ante on behalf of the provincial government sometime within the last year since this letter was sent. I find it also interesting that we're prepared to ignore what the federal report told us. What it told us was the ridership figures were very dubious. And I think some of us knew that. All of the onus of an underperforming ridership will come back directly to TransLink, directly to the taxpayer of this region to subsidize. The tunneling. If you do a little bit of investigation, you'll find that virtually every tunnel that's ever been dug has come in over budget. Now we know that all of the overrun on this tunneling will come back to this region to pay for. So they put $500 million into the tunnel. In Boston, they said it was going to cost $2 billion. And it's $16 billion and counting. And it's not complete yet. In Seattle, the tunnel went $500 million over budget. If this tunnel goes over budget, the only place that the revenues can come from is from the transit system. When the Millennium Line underperforms, we put out of the bus system, which performs, $26 million a year into subsidizing that underperforming Millennium Line. If we take more money, and they've already anticipated putting aside $60 million in the anticipatory period before ridership gets up to 100,000, again, that's money that has to come out of the system. Again, the federal report. You want to talk about this, Sam, as an environmental project. The federal report says clearly, they don't think this will reduce greenhouse gases. And we haven't even begun to assess the greenhouse implications of a cement tunnel. It's huge. We haven't even begun to assess that. The federal report also says that the ridership will take longer than the current system to get to and from many destinations. And there will in fact be a net reduction in service, bus service, in Vancouver. And those people who now travel from White Rock and South Surrey and Delta on a direct bus will have to transfer with the consequences that will take longer. So I think we're in a situation now where $300 million has been committed by TransLink, $300 million is on the table from the provincial government, $300 million is on the table from the airport, $300 million is there from the federal government,
30 seconds.
maybe a little bit more. We have the opportunity to do a system for $1.2 billion. And rather than try and squeeze an extra 150 million or bust out of Ottawa, or force this thing to sign a contract with a private company for $1.4 to $1.6 billion for 35 years, I think we need to go back to the drawing board and say, what can we do within the $1.2 billion that we have committed now? If the rest comes, fine. But let's not get stalled on completing a transit project simply because we're upset that we haven't got the full bump that now apparently Victoria seems to think we can get.
Councillor Lewis, second time.
Well, Your Worship, I'll be brief. There were just two remaining points that I was unable to adequately address the first time I spoke. The first issue is the fact that a large portion of the money will be coming from sources outside of the region. One of the most senior members of this council, Councillor George Pugh, many years before I was on council, said, and it was one of the few things that he and I always agreed on, there is only one taxpayer. And when Councillor Sullivan says that we should be voting for it because some of the money will be coming from outside of the region, please let's not forget, that's not free money. There is only one taxpayer. The other point is this, and Councillor Cadman touched on it. What will the impact be on greenhouse gas emission reductions? Let me get right to the numbers. 18,000 vehicles will be removed from the streets if all goes according to plan at a cost of $1.8 billion. That is a cost per vehicle of $100,000. That's before we take into consideration the lengthening of trip times that will occur for many commutes. I'm voting against the motion. Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Sullivan, third time, and
Well,
stay on topic.
Okay, I'll wrap up here. First of all, putting so much credibility on a federal report, which I understand isn't even public, but it is a federal report that was leaked, a federal report written by people who are loath to spend money in British Columbia, and especially to spend money in Vancouver. Let us just recall, if we don't vote for this, what we are voting for is $450 million investment in Kicking Horse Pass, a freeway. And I would challenge you to tell me how many cars are we going to get off the road by investing that money in a freeway in eastern British Columbia. I believe you owe it to your city to put Vancouver first. This is a chance to get $500 million into Vancouver. Vancouver jobs, Vancouver benefits, investment at last in transit. The alternative to vote against this is essentially voting to put that money into a freeway in eastern British Columbia. I think we all have to get on board. Councillor Lewis made a very astute calculation, mathematics. I do commend him on his mathematics. 18,000 vehicles, $100,000 per vehicle. But what he didn't say was that 18,000 vehicles per day for 150 years. Now, if he wants to make those kinds of calculations and calculate the greenhouse gas savings, I suggest that he will come up with quite a different figure. Just wrap up, I urge you to show a solid front to the federal government in getting them to invest in Vancouver. Thank you.
Seeing no further questions, all in favor of this motion? Opposed? Opposed, Councillor Woodsworth, Roberts, Cadman, Lewis, Bass. The motion is defeated. All those in favor? Oh, okay. And me. I'm sorry, I didn't see your hands up from there. So the motion passes. Now the second motion, Councillor Bass's.
This motion is simply that be it resolved that Vancouver City Council strongly endorse the federal government committing $450 million as its contribution to transit and the GRP. Now, according to a taxpayer organization, the federal government took $750 million out of BC in 2001 and returned 31 million. Meaning that's a figure of $719 million. Seems to be fairly modest to ask for $450 million to be put into public transit. I think we can all agree on that. Thank you.
Councilor Ladner? Oh, do you
Well,
want to say-
in my disappointment at the lack of unanimity on the previous motion, I'm going to go and vote in favor of Councilor Baz's motion. I agree with Councilor Cadman. It's great to get some of that federal money back here. It's our money anyway. And so, yeah, let's have it. But I have no illusions as to the likelihood of this money just dropping out of the sky here for no particular purpose when we had an option with a specific purpose that, or we have an option with a specific purpose that obviously is more attractive to them.
Councilor Green?
Thank you, Your Worship. I certainly support this motion, and I had a lot of trouble with the last motion supporting it because I think it does have some flaws in it. But having said that, I do want to comment on a couple of things. The federal report that we keep hearing about, I personally haven't seen, and when I've asked to get copies, I'm told they're not available. So I don't know if other people have copies, but I haven't seen it, and it makes it very difficult for me to base my judgment on a report that I've only read about in the Vancouver Sun. And as much as I trust the Vancouver Sun with my heart and soul, I don't necessarily want to speak up in council just based on an argument that I read in the Sun. I presume it's word for word true, but I'd rather have my own interpretation of a document before I make an important decision like this. The other thing I felt kind of was a little bit off was that if you're opposed to P3, you must vote no. Well, you know, I was on the expansion committee for the Trade and Convention Center for a couple of years. I see how these projects work. I supported that all the way through the line. I supported it on many attempts for P3s. The last one under the provincial Liberals was not the first attempt. And I think in most cases it's safe to say I'm adamantly opposed to P3s. Like another councillor said, there are probably cases where they work. I don't know of any, but I can say this about it. If they don't work, the people that are financing it are probably going to have enough sense to get out, like they did at the Trade and Convention Center. And so therefore I don't think by supporting something I'm necessarily supporting P3s. I would argue very strongly that I've had a lot of experience in that field and that that's not logical to me. It also is not logical to me that there's only one taxpayer if we're sharing the burden of paying for this with Newfoundland, the Maritimes, Quebec, the Prairie Provinces, Ontario, and British Columbia. I think there's more than, it's a very large taxpayer. I personally have never seen the study that says that every tunnel ever dug has a cost over budget. I don't know, maybe that's true, but I can't base my decision on that. The other thing is, I talked to Ian Jarvis today, who was the finance person for TransLink, and I ran some of these questions by him. And his position is very similar. I think that if things are not working, they're not going to be prepared to go ahead. Now, there may be political decisions that say, let's go ahead, let's don't worry about the next election, let's waste taxpayers' money. I guess that's a risk here. But I can tell you one thing, if we're going to have a government, like the provincial government, that guarantees the risk on a loan or on overcost on tunneling or whatever, that's going to show up on their books. That's going to show up as a liability of $1 billion or so. And with the provincial government, which is in deep trouble, I understand, Your Worship, that the Premier only has an acceptance rating of half of yours. So I think that he's in trouble. An election is coming. He doesn't want to add $1 billion deficit to this, no matter how much he might want it. So I think we're pretty sound if you look at the long-term approval rates and all. Geotechnical studies for the tunnel. We don't know that the tunnel will even work yet. Those studies are not complete. So before I say no to something, I want to make sure that I know all of the arguments that are involved, and then I'll say no. And if this thing turns out that it's a P3 at any cost, I'll be there to fight it in every way I can. But I think the best thing now is to support the motion that's before us.
I need a seconder for that motion. Seconded by Councillor Green. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor? Opposed? And I'm sorry, we're referring to, if you just read it out for me,
This is number one on Councillor
Yes.
Bass's motion. I believe 2 and 3 are redundant now. Number one is
Yes.
to be it resolved that Vancouver City Council strongly endorse the federal government committing to $450 million as its contribution to transit in the GVRD.
public transit.
To public transit.
All those in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously. New business, inquiries, or other, I'm sorry?
I just want to rise on